Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Solomon Kane. So, this is kind of an interesting choice because eventually I ended up finding out just by kind of Googling it while I was watching the movie. I'm like, oh my god, this is actually a Marvel comic book character, and I didn't even realize it. Supposedly, this was originally a Dark Horse comic book character, but then eventually, I guess, it went on to be a Marvel comic book character, and eventually you can Google it and find out that it's on the Marvel database. So I'm like, wow, that's kind of interesting. That like you end up just kind of finding random Marvel characters that are otherwise going to be tied to certain movies or certain shows, and you don't even realize it. So going into this film, whether it be seemingly because like this character is to basically be a pilgrim, hence why I kind of chose it because it's November now. And plus, also, it's kind of a smooth transition. It's to have that pilgrim-esque kind of look, but is to still have this kind of demonic kind of approach to it, also with demons and stuff like that going into this film. Uh, Really, and actually, a very enjoyable film. I really did like this. Uh, Really, I also at some points kind of felt that I might not have understood all of this world, but it's kind of witchcraft and wizardry and sorcery and stuff like that. So um, I think that this movie actually does a better job at being the Hugh Jackman Van Helsing movie than the Hugh Jackman Van Helsing movie does. Like, it's kind of like we have this character who is to eventually go off and seemingly not exactly be this demon killer person, but he's kind of forced into it because eventually his soul is to be forfeited to the devil. And so Solomon now has to go and figure out a way to uh, keep his soul from being damned. So he has to eventually go and vow that he is to forever uh, go on to keep the peace. So this is basically like the Wolverine movie, uh, not the Wolverine Origins, the one that came after that, where eventually Logan was trying to like be a peaceful person also and just kind of live out the rest of his life. So of course, as per usual, Solomon has to eventually go on uh, to be a part of a church, and he kind of gives up everything to be a part of this church until the priest is eventually going to tell Solomon, "Yeah, you should go. You should go and make your own path. Like you can't just stay idly here forever until you die. Like you need to go and do something." So Solomon eventually goes onto his path, his pilgrimage, so to speak, and is to eventually go and meet up with his family. Where eventually, uh, this family Solomon is to basically tell him it's like, well, hey, like, uh, I would love to eventually kind of team up with you guys or just kind of go along with you, but you don't exactly know who you're bringing in with you. Like a guy who had at some point basically killing was breathing to him. Like it was the easiest thing for him to do. And so then this family is just like, well, then just don't do it. Just like you don't like are you a killer now? No. Well, then just continue on that path. And so it's just like, oh yeah, I guess it's really just that easy. Yeah, it is. Just don't kill people. So so eventually Solomon is to eventually mix his way up with his family, and so all of a sudden it seems that becomes a reason for him to have to kill again, and then he has to go and reach up to the heavens to try and contact God to just say like, hey, like seriously, like is this all that I'm left to do? And so then Solomon does have to defend this family, and eventually he has to eventually go and try to wipe out this evil to eventually make it to the one girl that he is to promise her father that he will save her. So it's a really interesting ride. It's really interesting visuals that are being put into this film, And also, we start to also intertwine Solomon's backstory, which I'll talk about more in the spoiler variation of this. Uh, I guess there's one thing that we can say that Solomon evidently was to have been mixed up in royalty, and he was to give that all up to eventually become a seemingly a pirate-ish like character, but they end up calling him something different in this movie. They end up calling him an English privateer. Okay, sure. Um, like in the very beginning of the review, I might have to say some odd or weird words here. Um, but anyways, let's. So this movie is to have witchcraft and sorcery, so that might be a very much interesting thing for people eventually to pick this movie up and want to check it out. Um, Probably Hugh Jackman, Van Helsing will obviously become a thing that people will immediately compare this to. A lot of people will probably compare this to like God of War probably at some point in this film, which I can understand that. Um, and some people might just compare this to kind of any random kind of video game of sorts, because that might happen at some point too. Um, but yeah, like maybe like God, what was the one movie called, or the one video game called like Born something, Bloodborne? Maybe a lot of people might have that comparison weirdly. Um, but with that said, let's go out of our way to go into that double five time territory. Let's just go into spoilers because I'll talk about this movie more. Um, how did I feel about this? Where could you go out of your way to find this film? Currently, right now, to the second of this recording, it is on an app called Tubi, Tubi. Go and otherwise check this movie out because without a doubt, it was actually really good. I really enjoyed it. Like, so I would have to say probably the grading would easily just be said as like a good or better, depending on how you feel about this film. I would say that it's a good film. I might not understand the whole world of things. There was stuff that I tried to Google and couldn't find the answers for, especially when we have these like mirrored demons that we end up seeing in this film, which I'm like, okay, so what are those things called? And I couldn't find the exact like title or something because there isn't much of information that it's be dipped into here. So I just kind of had to just kind of like, when we get to spoilers, I'll just be like, mirror demon, because that's all that I could really say of what they actually are. Larger mirror demon. That is to seemingly have this lava-ish like look to it. Or whichever, we'll get to that. So let's go into it. Let's go into that double five time territory, because it's about that time yet again to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. Visually interesting movie. I would say it's definitely worth watch. But there was also like this plan, of course, to go into here because really it was a pilgrim-ish like piece. I almost said something weird there. Um, so eventually, I'm gonna somehow in November find some better choices during November to otherwise tie into possibly Thanksgiving or something like that. But I'm also going to attach myself onto some mystery films because that seems like a random thing to eventually put into this month. Uh, so let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So this, of course, is to take place around the year 1600. The beginning of this movie is supposedly supposed to be in North Africa, and then eventually it might bleed into any number of other things. So Solomon Kane, as well as his other men along with him, where he is to seemingly at first be this pirate-ish like character. Evidently, these guys are to be called English privateers. Sure. They are to go on to this fortress town to eventually go into this one castle to seemingly fight off these people called Ottoman occupiers. Sure. Ottoman occupiers. Weird names. Supposedly, at some point in this movie, one of the kids is to ask Solomon Kane if he had ever fought off Spain or the Spanish. And so I don't know if that has any real actual tie to what's going on in this beginning of this piece. I'm not sure. But eventually they were to have said that at some point in this film. So Kane is to smash his way through this castle, eventually going and putting his boot upon someone's throat to ask them where the throne room is, and eventually is to try and ask them in their native tongue. There is no subtitles in here because I guess there's this one little blip of this moment where there is to be this kind of dialogue being put into a different language. So I think they just didn't bother to do anything with that. So I believe, I guess, Solomon is to eventually go and get his answer. And so now we have these guys walking through this seemingly hallway, making it their way to eventually this throne escher-like room that has these double doors, which eventually Kane has to kind of swing open and eventually go through this throne room. But before we get there, eventually what is to happen while Kane and his men are walking through this hallway is all of a sudden we have these many collection of mirrors. All of a sudden we have these demons that are seemingly breaking through these mirrors, and of course they end up going on and breaking through these mirrors, grabbing these people, and Solomon ends up going through these double doors and having them close behind him before really realizing that probably all of his men are dead behind him. So since Solomon has nothing better to do, he just continues to just walk to this throne room to all of a sudden have these shadow esh-like things appearing and kind of waving around till eventually they go and collect upon this one throne to all of a sudden have this very cloaked individual that could possibly look like anything from a Lord of the Rings kind of thing here. And so this character is to supposedly be the Devil's Reaper. And so the Devil's Reaper is to have come here to collect Solomon Kane's soul because he has done enough evil, and now the devil wants to have Kane's soul. And Kane is, of course, to refuse, because why wouldn't he? To basically just say that, like, well, hey, like, God would not let you take my soul. And the Devil's Reaper is just like, do you really think that, like, God is watching over you right now? No. So Kane eventually is to go and try to fight this Reaper, but like this Reaper is so overly powered, having a massive flamed sword, and Kane just having two swords upon himself, trying to figure out a way to take this thing down. But instead he decides to escape and jump out of this glass and to go and fall upon, I believe, this thing of water, where the Reaper is to tell him that he is forever damned. So Solomon Kane is to give up war completely, fighting indefinitely, and is to go on to these preachers and to be a man of peace. So eventually Solomon is to be approached by this preacher and is to say, like, hey man, like, you have gone on to, like, be at this church for far long enough. You need to go and find your own path. You eventually need to like, get the heck out of here. Like, we're tired of your face. I'm joking. So Solomon is like, well, hey, I've given up all my wealth. Like, I've given up everything that I have to be here, And the preacher is like, well, that's great, but like, sorry, like, you need to go. Like, if anything, you have to walk your path. You have to go on a pilgrimage and eventually go and live. Like, you need to have like some kind of real kind of thing that you're going to do. So Solomon eventually is to leave this church to eventually go and find his path. And so while he's to go on to eventually walk his path, eventually he is to go and find this family that are to be kind of this horse and buggy kind of family. Because eventually Solomon is to go and be uh, kind of taken advantage of by these three guys who are to be Skinhead, Tattoo, and Beard, who are to eventually go and smack Solomon across the head because he would not fight them, and so he would not fight them. They go and they just take his stuff and leave. So eventually, Solomon is to wake up in this horse and buggy with this girl Meredith to trying to be like healing his wounds. And so eventually, when Solomon is to talk to William, who's like the dad of this situation, he's like, your daughter has healing hands," and he's like, "Well, yeah, I'm grateful for her." So let's go into a flashback now. So to kind of give us some understanding of Solomon's like backstory. So evidently Solomon was to be uh, a man that eventually could become a person of the crown, but Joe Josa Kane, the father of seemingly both Marcus and Solomon, was to basically Josiah. Yeah, let's go with that. Josiah was to eventually tell Solomon that he needs to go off to these priests and eventually like go and seek priesthood for the rest of his life. And Solomon Kane is like, no, like I want to go and choose my own path. And Josiah is just like, well, like if you do not do what I tell you to do, you are eventually going to have to forfeit like your royalty position and everything like that. And Solomon's like, okay, fine. Like so Solomon just easily goes and walks away from this castle to all of a sudden find his older brother Marcus going and seemingly beating up some woman. Solomon tries to stop Marcus and accidentally is to eventually push Marcus off this cliff and have him supposedly fall to his death, where to led to believe. Which we end up finding later that might not have actually been the case. So, like I think that is all of the flashbacks that I think ended up happening. Uh, yeah, I think so. So Solomon is to like be back in current time, and so eventually William is to take a liking to Solomon, and so like William is just like, well, hey, like would you mind kind of accompanying us to where we're going? And so Solomon is to continue to give William kind of a heads up that basically this guy was to, of course, in his past be this guy who ended up killing people. And so William is just like, nah, like, okay, like if anything, I guess that'll be good in case we end up actually having things go horribly awry. But it doesn't seem like Solomon is going to kill these people. So William is just like, okay, so yeah, Like, it seems like you haven't hurt any number of us, so I think you should be fine. So eventually William is to like ask him to just be like, well, hey, like, you can come with us. And so Solomon is like, I really don't think you understand like how, like, I used to be a really bad guy, that I used to just like be glad to just murder like so many people, and this and that. We have this like real, like, Solomon is to mention like that he just loved a body count, and that's all that really mattered. And so that Solomon is to eventually had figured to have gone with God, and eventually wanted to become a much more peaceful person. And William is just like, well, then just like keep on that path, like keep going, and trying uh, to keep your peace. Just do it with us. Just go ahead. So eventually Meredith is to eventually give Solomon some new clothes, because his clothes are to be very worn out and very just to the point of having him start to look like all of these other people. And so eventually we continue on with his family, and eventually we have a point where they are to be setting up camp. And so Solomon and Samuel um, are to go on to eventually go and no, wait. Uh, we have one scene before this. So Solomon and the family are to eventually go and seemingly find a town that had been burnt to the ground. And so Solomon ends up going with his family. I think he ends up going with the oldest, who is uh, to actually be Edward and William. And they go into the town and end up seeing that numerous people have had their eyes burnt and had been killed that way. So eventually, more and more, these people are to slowly but surely head into this town, and all of a sudden, there's to be one girl that is to have been left alive. So they end up going and taking this girl and trying to give her food and whatever, because they probably naturally assumed that she had probably been starving or whatever, or just been so scared, or for whatever reason. So all of a sudden, this girl is to divulge this story, and she is to mention that um, there had been a witch that they had burnt to the stake, and this girl just kind of, this witch was to laugh at all these flames, and then this witch was to go and burn off all these people's eyes and kill them all off, because like she was so strong. Um, and this, I guess, is obviously during some kind of witchcraft like trials and stuff like that, kind of like the Salem moments and stuff like that, where eventually like even Solomon was to almost be accused of like, well, hey, like maybe you are some sorcerer of sorts, and maybe we can just shove you into this fire and do away with you. And because the three guys that are eventually going to clock him off to the side of the head were to say that maybe he's some sorcerer of some kind. Uh, but so eventually Solomon is to hear this story and is just go like, okay, this is really interesting. So eventually Solomon is to eventually ask William his cross, and is to go and like, hey girl, like you're going to need this so that way you can feel safe. Put on this cross necklace so you can probably just like, because you're going to need it more than any of us will. So the closer and closer that Solomon gets this girl, eventually she is to do this magic upon Meredith to eventually put this seemingly black into her hand, which I guess to possibly be some marker of sorts. I don't know exactly what all that really meant, but I guess a marker for anyone else is to be evil, to realize that this girl is to eventually be the one that Solomon is to have wanted, so they got a bargaining chip here. So this girl is to have, of course, turned into this witch, and so Solomon is to eventually figure out a way to kill this witch or to try and wipe it out. And by using like flames and stuff like that to get this thing away, because he is still desperately trying to keep the peace. So like it's really good that Solomon had figured this out, because otherwise no one would have realized this. So eventually the family is to push on, and so eventually, while again they're to establish camp, um, we have the three guys who were to pick on uh, Solomon before had decided to go to join this raiders army, and there's to be this masked rider who is to be supposed to be who is to be like touching people and like and turning them into this like demon-esque like versions of themselves, and kind of just kind of putting these like scars upon their face, and like I guess eventually that's where they also get these markers upon their face also. So eventually these guys are raiding and tearing apart every town, I guess, to eventually try and find Solomon Kane, or eventually just having people join his ranks. And eventually, when there are some people that are to go against uh, the way of the raiders, they decide to go and crucify them at some point, which ends up happening later. So so we push on. So eventually Samuel and Solomon are to just kind of walk off away from where the family is, because Samuel was to have heard this noise, and so both Solomon and Samuel go off to eventually try and like see what this whole ruckus was, to eventually find out that these people are going and grabbing all these people and shoving them into these cages that are to be horsebacked. So Solomon is realizing that what's going on here. So Solomon is to eventually tell Samuel to run back to the family, to tell him like, "Hey, let's get the frickin' heck out of here." So Samuel is to run back to the family, realizing that it's too late. All of the Raider characters are all of a sudden to go and uh, grab onto this family. And so Solomon is to start hearing like people like either fighting or people getting killed from the Crawthorn side. And so Solomon ends up running back. And so eventually we have one guy who is to eventually be a person to tell Solomon, it's like, well, hey, like, if you kill me, like, we will eventually just kind of let you go. And so Solomon is just like, what? Like, if you kill me, my soul will be or if I kill you, your soul will be forever my. Solomon is to mention that if he kills this guy, his soul will be forever damned. And so there is this kind of like, well, like, I'm not going to want to try and kill this guy because it does not seem right. he's consistently trying to be this peacemaker, but like there's this fork in the road here. So all of a sudden we have all these knives otherwise going, or swords otherwise going, to eventually kill all of this family. And so now Solomon has this moment where he's going to look up at the heavens to ask God, it's like, is this all that I am to you? Like, am I just a murderer? Am I just going to have to just go on for the rest of my life killing, and that's all that's left for me to really do? So basically, since God will not answer Solomon, he's just like, well, I guess I'm finally going to have to fight, and it's something that I would do gladly. And so now Kane is to go and just easily go and take this guy and take his head and take this knife and break his arm and eventually stab this guy in the side. And so while that's going on, all this family is trying to fight for their lives, and we start to, of course, see William ends up getting killed. Samuel sadly ends up getting killed. Because Samuel was to get his throat sliced, because supposedly he was, out of all of this family, he was to be the actual bravest one out of all of them. And so that's what started Solomon to really want to go and kill off all of these people because of the one kid getting killed. So eventually, Meredith is to be taken by these raiders, and they are to go and run off with her because she is the special one chosen. And so we have Solomon who goes to William before he is to die, and William is to say, it's like, well, if you go and you save my daughter, I will make it so that you are to be able to go to heaven if you are to die. Like, this whole damnation thing, and that you're to be, like, your soul's to be forfeited to hell, like, no. Like, if you save my daughter, I will make sure you have a way to make it to heaven. And then William dies. So, Catherine is to eventually hold William as he's to die, because she's his wife, and I guess like she couldn't have gone anywhere else or wanted to go anywhere else, but to basically be there with her husband as he is to die. So Solomon is just like, well, okay, like I have something to do here, I have a goal to reach. So eventually Solomon is to eventually go on and start going through and killing all these raiders, and eventually rescuing all these people from these cages, and eventually asks them if they had seen Meredith. And so a lot of people are to say that she doesn't look familiar, and so eventually, like, he continues to try and figure out where this Meredith is. So eventually there is to supposedly be a point where Solomon is to go on and go to this church to try and find some peace and be able to like pray to God. And he is to bump into this one preacher, Father Michael. And so Father Michael is to eventually tell Solomon that Father Michael had kept some of the people, some of his flock, and kept them in this one basement, because eventually they all turned demonic. And so Solomon is like, why did you keep them all here? Why wouldn't you have killed them all off? Why wouldn't you have burned them? And Father Michael is just like, well, like I have to have, like, it was the right thing to do to keep them alive and to feed them. And so eventually, Father Michael is to toss Solomon into this basement with all these demons for now Solomon to have to kind of quickly fight all these demons off. I believe also Father Michael was to let Solomon know before he was to get tossed into this whole demon onslaught of things that who he's technically facing, that he is fighting some masked rider who eventually is to have a guy that is to be his uh, be his boss called Malekith. Um, yeah. So, because I was trying to decipher, I'm like, okay, so does the actual Masked Rider character actually have a name? Because wouldn't that have made sense? Supposedly, they may have at some point had called him Overlord or something like this in this movie. Um, but then again, so eventually Solomon is to now be kind of forced to go and fight off all these demons, and of course he easily does. And so he eventually makes his way out of this little like cave-ish like area to come out the other end to all of a sudden be finding himself mixed up with the three guys that had tried to steal from him before. And now they're all like blackened eyes and very much more demonic. So eventually, Solomon is to go and kill all of these guys off to eventually leave this one bearded guy, or the guy who's called just Beard. And so Solomon is kind of pushing this guy against this little place where all these demons were to be at, this little hole. And so Solomon is like, okay, where is Meredith? Like, I want to know exactly where she is. And so this bearded man is to say that Meredith is to be dead. And so Solomon is to, I guess, take that answer and believe that it is true. So Solomon is just to realize that his soul is forfeit. And so, of course, he is to just be very upset by this news, thinking that Meredith is supposedly dead, even though Meredith isn't actually dead. She is just to be put into some caged area where Solomon just cannot find her. So Solomon goes off to this bar, drinking his woes, thinking that the world is ending, and because he's going to be spending his afterlife in hell. So all of a sudden, Henry Telford is to eventually approach Solomon and say, like, hey, like, are you Captain Solomon? Like, we had been with you in the times before and fought alongside you, and like, is there a way for you to combine forces with us to go after this evil of this world? And Kane is just like, no, like, uh the one of which that was to save my soul is now dead, so like I'm just gonna I'm just gonna sit here and drink my woes and eventually realize that I'm just gonna go to hell anyways. So all of a sudden, uh Malachi's men, the raiders, are to eventually approach this town and then go off and start to crucify people that were, I guess, going to create an alliance against this evil. And so one of the people who were to get crucified was Solomon Kane. So eventually these characters are to eventually get crucified, held up. And so all of a sudden, one of the caged areas, um, or one of the cage horse and buggy things, is to eventually have Meredith on it. So Meredith is screaming for Solomon to help her, and Solomon is like, "Oh my God, Meredith, you're still alive!" As like Solomon is to be crucified upon this thing. Like I'm just like, man, this kind of reminds me of like Cyborg, or eventually like Jean Claude eventually like uncrucified himself, and then eventually went after the woman that he needed to go to and defeat the evil in that movie. So eventually, now having Solomon realize that Meredith is still alive, he's like, God, give me strength. And so Solomon goes and rips his hand from out of uh, this spot of which that he was to get crucified, to eventually figure out how to uncrucify himself, and to basically have to um, realign himself with these men, um, that they had asked him for his help, to just say, okay, yeah, we're going to do this. Like, we're going to go and we're going to fight against these people because it's the right thing to do. And it's also going to help me rescue Meredith. So, because Solomon is to him and all the other people are to go off to just go and sleep and to just kind of rest up. And plus, also, Solomon is to get his wounds kind of, it's hole through his hand, just kind of bandaged up. So Solomon goes and takes all these bandages off, and he's like, dude, I'm ready for war. Let's go. Because this guy does not, this guy does not like slow down. Um, Eventually, even when he's hurt or he's kind of like, he's whatever, he just gets right back up and he's like, no, we gotta go. I gotta prove my worth to this family. Especially when Meredith was healing him before in the horse and buggy. Solomon ended up getting up, and he was like, hey, like, how can I help you people? Because like I just can't sit here and just uh, just lay into your horse and buggy and eventually get better that way. So Solomon goes off with these people to eventually find out that the place of which that he is to go to eventually fight Malekith is to actually be uh, his own castled home. He has to go back home basically to fight off Malekith. So he's like, wait a minute, what? Like, I have to go back to my hometown, basically to my home, and fight these people. Like, okay, this is this is interesting. So, uh, because eventually they kind of take down these raiders and eventually find out uh, where Malekith is to like sit on a throne and just kind of wait for Solomon to come and get him to basically kill him off. So eventually Meredith is to go and to be in Malekith's castle and to be held there, uh, because you really have to go and like play this up as you got to get the girl from the tower basically, or the castle. So Solomon goes on is to just kind of make his way through this castle, but he basically doesn't go right through the front door, because Solomon is to tell his people, it's like, hey man, we're not going through the front door. Like, dude, I've spent so much time in this castle. I know there's kind of secret passageways and there's other ways to get in here besides the front door. We're not going to take the front door. So eventually, Solomon and his men go into the castle and kind of fight their way to eventually get to Malekith. And so eventually, Solomon is to separate from his men, and he is to eventually go on and fight them. Or no, wait. Solomon ends up kind of going and eventually going into the prison cells to rescue all the people from the prisons, to all of a sudden find out um, that Josiah, his own father, is a prisoner there. And so Solomon is like, oh my God, like, my father is not the king of this castle. What is going on here? So all of a sudden Solomon is to ask his father what had happened, and so his father is to say that uh, that Marcus, Solomon's older brother, was to have fallen but was to have not died. Supposedly, his injuries was so severe that eventually Marcus was to go on to just be in this coma. And so Josiah was to eventually find any kind of means to heal his son, and couldn't find a conventional means, so he ended up finding this sorcerer, which was Malekith. And Josiah was to offer Malekith anything, basically like, hey man, you can take my throne, you can take my crown, take it all, I don't care, just give me back my son. So of course Malekith took that throne and is like, okay, well, you're just gonna be a prisoner now. So Marcus did come back, but he was not the Marcus that Josiah remembered. So really, we find out that Marcus is to actually be the masked rider. And so now Solomon Kane has to go and fight his own brother to eventually make his way to Malekith, or Malekith. So Solomon is to try and rescue his father from these chains, but they're to be magical chains, so Josiah will never be able to get out of them. So Josiah is to tell Solomon that he needs to kill him, so that way that'll be the only way Josiah can be free. So Solomon forcefully does do so because of his father's request. And so then Solomon goes off to go and fight off Marcus. Uh, so we have this moment where Marcus is trying to, or we have Solomon trying to talk and reason with Marcus, but that's not going to work. So really, it just goes to where like Solomon doesn't even really want to fight his brother because of really Solomon blames himself for Marcus's condition and eventually his end result. So Marcus and Solomon are fighting it out, and so eventually Solomon is to eventually stab into Marcus to really not have that do any good. So uh, Solomon just decides to go and put a torch to Marcus, and that really doesn't do much good either. To where like now like Marcus is just kind of flailing around, to where Solomon is just have to like figure out a way to just kind of continue to take out Marcus. So eventually Marcus is to eventually get killed, to now have the ability of Solomon to be able to focus much more on Malekith. So Solomon goes to Malekith, and so Malekith has this grand master plan that he is going to go and make Meredith bleed and take her blood and slap it upon this massive mirror of this large demonic thing, which is to seemingly have this lava-esh like look to it. And so I'm like, wait a minute. Like, Solomon had a hard enough time trying to take down his own brother. Now he's fighting massive lava creature, and he's supposed to take this thing down somehow or another. Like, I was expecting somebody just to like come in and like blast this thing away with some kind of cannon or something. Like, I was expecting there to have some kind of weird weaponry that Solomon could have figured out to be able to use against this thing, but that didn't quite exactly happen. So Solomon is trying to take this thing down, and he is like jumbling all over it, trying to figure out how to take this thing down. And so it seems that eventually, when um, Malekith is to get killed, that this demon is to force itself back into uh, this mirror, I believe. And let me pause for 1 second just to rethink my way of doing things before we finish this up. So we have the Solomon, who is to, of course, need the blood of Malekith to end this whole thing. Because if Meredith was to be the one that opened this, Malekith was to be the one to close this mirror. So weirdly, so Solomon is trying to like kind of dance around against this creature, eventually having it smack into these columns of sorts. And so Solomon is trying to dance around it. So eventually Malekith is getting close to the mirror, holding a knife to Meredith. And so all of a sudden Solomon is to bust out this pistol and go and shoot Solomon perfectly in the head, having this blood splatter upon this mirror. And all of a sudden, I guess because of Solomon's magic, we weirdly have this demon that is to kind of be channeled through Solomon to go back into this mirror. And so I'm wondering if Solomon after this has some magical abilities of sorts, or was this just kind of like a one-time kind of thing that Solomon was to just do? You would have thought that eventually he would have had some kind of weird abilities to him or something like that. That eventually, if they were to kind of go into the sequel, he'd be like, oh, well, Solomon now has this strange ability to him now, or this unique thing with him to maybe give him much more of a powered like character instead of having him simply just be this normal common man. But so I guess we are to naturally assume after this, like we were to have assumed that Solomon was going to take on his throne and eventually become king. But surefire enough, we just have Solomon after he ends up getting Meredith. Like they end up just kind of just going on to another pilgrimage, and basically Solomon is not going to eventually become king of this place. It's just like, hey man, like anybody can just be whoever. But Kane is to eventually just go on to again walk another path, to eventually not be this king, and to eventually just go on and fight more evil, or to eventually find more evil. Because I guess really just him going along with Meredith is to have eventually had uh, Solomon supposedly like keep up his promise, and we end up having it to where Solomon is lying on the ground and is to basically tell Meredith to shoot him and just be like, hey, like I lived up to my promise, so now you can let me go, and I will be gladly like die now because I can go to heaven. Meredith doesn't pull the trigger, so eventually this movie ends with I'm assuming Solomon just going off on to another journey supposedly. Uh, so with that said, I think that's all that I wanted to say about this movie. I think I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.